So first question today is, can you provide examples of how the use of qualitative or quantitative risk management as an approach has helped organizations? And the first one's going to Ross to start.
Thanks, Ken. The example I'd like to give is from a company that I have done work for. By using these methods, we've been able to identify places within our technology that we suffered risk, exposure, possible sources of damage that could be exploited. But also from other areas in our business, we were able to identify places where other sorts of processes, other sorts of, say, human resource protections were lacking. We were able to expand well beyond the technology only, which is oftentimes what my experience says people perceive this as a technique for dealing with. But we were able to expand it into much broader areas of the business overall and get a lot of value by putting up different sort of contingency plans where if some adverse event happened in or out of the technology, we would be able to respond effectively, minimizing damage and saving ourselves an awful lot of extraordinary expense. And that's one of the things that we try to do all the time, is make broader use of these methods to get that better, broader business value.
Great. Vinny?
Yeah, so I'll take up an example. So when we are talking about qualitative or quantitative risk analysis, it has its own set of advantages and disadvantages. Now, when you are doing a qualitative risk analysis, you are basically trying to understand the organization posture. In this given scenario, in today's scenario, most of the organization, when you talk about, are performing qualitative analysis in order to as part of the entire risk analysis process. Now, how it has served, and it has been working for many years for most of the organizations. But when you look at the set of understanding from the set of results that are coming out of this entire process, you will not be able to actually calculate the set of risk on ROI on some of the control environment that you have to deploy across your organization. Now, given the set of understanding, if you look at it, if you do not today, everybody wants to understand about what is the return on investment that you're getting while you are investing onto some of these pieces, and security is not something which has been left behind. I think everybody wants to understand. Now, when you look at it, the kind of environment that we are living in today is dynamically changing, and the set of processes that we are following in terms of doing the risk analysis have to be also looked into a manner where we are able to derive some qualitative output and then a quantitative output of the entire process. Now, given this the importance that we are talking about from an example standpoint, I think each of these have their own set of areas where you have to look at. Qualitative has its set of benefits and quantitative has its own set of benefits. Today, you cannot only just go with one kind of a methodology, and you have to look at both of the parameters, which is both at the qualitative measures and then well as the quantitative risk management practices in order to actually see what is best suited for your organization and how it is going to derive much value to the organization.
No, that's great. I think one of the things that we're trying to make sure that people understand is that there's no such thing as kind of two camps. You're not siding with one type of risk management process over another, but the hybrid approach sometimes is really valuable and worth it. In case people didn't hear what I was trying to introduce originally, was the way this is going to work is we're asking questions and we're going to alternate between the speakers. And as we work through the process, sort of build a story around risk management and the importance of doing this. So.
You're muted again.
I'm not sure why that does that.
It's called artificial intelligence.
That's right. That's going to be the next subject. I'm going to bring up the mute button thing with that. What we want to be able to talk about here is, and Vinny kind of touched on it a little bit, is sort of the ROI with using these different parameters. But so Vinny, the next question is going to go to you, is to kind of explain, it's one of the questions that I've heard in particular over the years from different organizations is, is there a return on the investment that I put into, performing a risk management assessment on my organization, for instance?
So absolutely, Ken, you are right. Today, risk return on investment on security is an important topic, and which is even the board want to hear something out of it. Today, see, when you talk about in today's scenario, security is something which is like a Pandora box. You keep on investing into it, and then there is no limit where you can stop it. Okay, so there are so many things which are there out in the universe in terms of the products, in terms of the standards, in terms of the frameworks, and then for everything and anything to follow, you need to have some kind of a budget where you need to actually so you can effectively control some of these. Now, not sure if in case the qualitative and the quantitative is the debate that we are talking about, does it help? But obviously I have seen in set of my own personal experiences, qualitative risk analysis has been definitely the quantitative risk analysis has been definitely been able to help organization in terms of arriving to those specific set of inputs or controls which can be prioritized for the organization from an investment perspective. So if I have to talk about and put a little more information to it, when you are doing a quantitative risk analysis, you are basically trying to understand the control environment with the set of adversary that are there out there, and you try to understand your environment, your sector, your industry where you are operating. If you are able to narrow down onto some of these important pieces in terms of understanding what all are those attackers, what all are their attack patterns, what are the methodologies that they are following, at least you can start uh, building up some of the controls which where you are able to protect your environment, at least to the adversary which are very pertinent in your region or industry. Number one. Now, for that, you need to first have an understanding about what is it. So if in case you have lacking with some of the basic controls like firewall for that matter, or you have and in the COVID scenario where we are talking about, if you are operating out of a remote work remotely from your home, uh, there are likely chances that the attacker methodologies today would be that they would like to impact your desktops or your endpoints which are there, and then they would like to see if in case they are able to penetrate into your router or switches which are there at your homes, and then probably try to take control of your desktop. Now, from an organization standpoint, you have to understand that while these some of these communications are happening from your endpoints to your organization systems and infrastructure, what are the controls that you have deployed? uh, Now, until unless you do not understand the methodologies and the patterns that the attackers are following, it's very unlikely that you may just end up putting up some control or solution in your organization which may not be very effective. So to reach to that, you have to come across with some kind of solutions or practices where you are able to identify the list of or the set of risks which may have a direct impact to your organization given the current scenario or the adversary's attack pattern, and then based on that you are going ahead and starting to invest into the control environment for your organization. So that is what I would say.
Great. Russ?
I think Vineet has made some excellent points. The thing that in my experience I've run into when I'm asked the question about the return on investment or return on security investment, very much to his point, you can invest as much as you want and still not have a perfect defensible environment. And that's one of the problems that senior executives and board level have, is that no matter how much you spend, it will never be perfect because there's always someone clever enough or devious enough to either penetrate it through technology or through the human element. What I find is a very effective way to, shall we say, direct their thinking on this is to think more in terms of economic value add. And I define it this way. You put in place a device, you calculate how much you want to spend on that device, and think about its functionality. When you think about that, you're solving a problem, but you can solve it for $1,000 or $5,000 or $10,000. Again, illustrating the point that Vineet made about you can spend as much as you want. But the economic value add is about looking at what your loss expectancy is before you do something and what it is after you've done that particular thing that you're thinking about doing. And when you've reduced your risk through that particular widget that you're going to install, and you make your calculations, when you reach a point where whatever losses you might experience are within an acceptable range, they begin to see, the audience being board members and senior executives, they begin to see that now, instead of being exposed to losses or impacts that may be effectively unlimited, certainly not really well bounded, they begin to see that it's really an effective way of reducing it down to a level that the company can withstand and even plan for in a contingency plan. So it's not the classic ROI that a person looks for when they invest in a stock or a bond or a commodity of some sort. It's a better way of looking at how smart you can be when spending your money to get the best value add and an appropriate level of risk reduction, potential exposure and damage that is, by spending intelligently based on a risk management method.
No, that's great. I mean, it used to be, especially when I first got into this, it was really difficult. You know, I get asked the same question, like, how do you measure that? It was really a tough thing to do back then. But in today's world, it's a lot easier. There's a lot of studies and research has been done out in the industry that actually describes, you know, what does a piece of data cost if you lost it.
To your point just now, the one benefit that I think I can actually point to with confidence is having had so many more events, we are now getting much better data about what the losses are, how they're caused, and just
Exactly.
how large they can be. So if anything positive comes out of it, it gives us a much better foundation to make these analyses and calculations on.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, every day we're bombarded with how much it's cost an organization in order to in recovery costs, and there's so many other things too. Like there's also when we talk about reputational damage, that reputational damage it lives on in perpetuity because there are thousands of news outlets out there that are absolutely hungry for anything cyber news related. So your organization ends up in the media and it just lives on forever. There's a lot of organizations that have already done analysis on what a breach costs. Those things are already there, which we didn't used to have before. So, you know, even if you couldn't pinpoint exactly what the ROI is for an organization, you just need to reference these other materials from the research to be able to say, well, you know, do you want to stay in business? Do you want to understand how to suffer a loss? As to your point, as you made earlier, Ross, so many businesses don't survive these breaches at all. So the ROI was,
that is very
ROI
true.
it's easy.
The other thing, just to kind of put another point on it, one of the things that risk analysis, risk management allows you to do is to weigh the secondary and tertiary effects of these events, which are very much exactly what you just spoke of. Classic analysis only looks at the primary impact, but it can be, as you said, the reputational damage and that sort of thing, a secondary effect that can be far more costly. And because it is almost hidden, you could say, it's very difficult to calculate. However real we know it is, it can be extremely large, and to your point, it can threaten the business's existence.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, that's great. Any last points on that, Vinny?
Yeah, so I'll definitely add on to what Ross has mentioned that today uh, the security or information security or cyber security, when we talk about, is not a technology issue, it's a business issue. Okay, it's
100%.
related to business.
Absolutely.
It's something which is related to the digital assets, and whatever information you hold today, whether it's a PII or it's a PFI or it's a client confidential information, each of these information carries some importance for your organization, because this is which is going to help you in terms of achieving your business objective. And any compromise on any of these assets through any of the mechanism may be liable to some kind of a penalty for your organization. Now, either it could be a penalty, it could be a loss of asset, it could be a damage, it could be a reputational loss for the organization, it could be a productivity loss. So there are various factors and parameters which are associated with it. Now, if we say that there is one silver bullet which can be able to track everything and help the organization to overcome all of these issues, I would say no. But again, it is important that you are able to understand your organization priorities, and based on the priorities, you are able to actually invest into the right set of security tools, the practices, the frameworks, or the standards for that matter, so that it helps you in overcoming some of these issues and the challenges which you are seeing on a day in, day out basis.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole exercise here is in risk reduction. There's nobody saying that this is going away 100%, that, you know, there's some kind of silver bullet, but it really is risk reduction. And the idea is just to try to make it as difficult as possible for somebody to be able to breach your organization. If you work on the principle that, you know, most criminal organizations are really looking for the path of least resistance, the more resistance you put up based on analysis like this, it's obviously going to help the organization. So.
Absolutely. And to add to your point, the adversary today are not looking at what standard framework or solutions you're following.
That's right.
Their only objective is to find out a way in to get into your organization, I think, and then get handle of those data or exfiltrate that data, so that they are able to go back to the dark web or to the to any of else, and they can actually start selling some of those proprietary or confidential information which can give them. Now, the attack patterns, the methodologies may be evolving, and it will continue to evolve on a day in, day out basis. Like Ross mentioned, talking about the artificial intelligence and machine learning or any other new technologies, the digital, there is quite a digital transformation which is happening in the industry. And then in the post-COVID era, we all know how we have been able to fast pace on some of the digital transformation journey that we have seen. I think with the set of transformation that we have undertaken, I think at the same pace, the adversaries or the attackers have also undertaken some of these approaches. And this has evolved the way they have been actually trying to get onto your set of data or information in order to exfiltrate or get in, take it away.
For sure. Next question is, does using these approaches provide a competitive advantage? That one goes to Ross, sorry.
Okay. My experience has been this. In the early days of this, and the early days are only in the past by 20 or 30 years, people were not asking about, well, what's your cybersecurity like? Because it was a relatively new and novel thing. Today, what I find is one of the very first sets of questions following, what do you do that can help me in my business? Is now the question, all right, what is your cybersecurity and risk management like? Because a very hot topic in my experience with my clientele these days is, how secure is my supply chain? And that begs the question, well, in my supply chain, I have several members. Could any of them be a single point of failure or a high risk that will in some way transfer to me? If they're weak, am I weak as a result? And so what I've experienced is, the more secure the supply chain members are individually, the perception is that the supply chain itself becomes stronger and more secure. And so far, the evidence seems to bear that out. But it's definitely a question. And I've experienced a case where clients of mine were chosen over others because our cybersecurity was better. And that's not me taking credit. It's me recognizing a fact. It is a case of risk transferring along the lines of the parties that are signatory to contract relationships. And they understand, whether they know the risk in depth or not, they understand that the risk comes to them from that other source. And they've really begun to appreciate just how much of a business differentiator risk management, proper risk management, and the resulting security measures that that member takes, how big of a difference that can make in a positive way to the overall security of the business supply chain that they're in.
Yeah, that totally makes sense, actually. I mean, I've seen myself, I've worked with a lot of, when I say small companies, I mean, they're 10 people, but they've got multi-million-dollar contracts with really, you know, ginormous companies in the world. And those people take seriously, you know, security very seriously, and expect those companies that they're dealing with to take that as well. And so in their evaluation, that's one of the things that they look for is, you know, how robust is your security? Because if I'm entrusting you with, you know, my IP or anything related to my business, I need to know that you're doing everything you can to protect that. So as you as a small business,
the question.
yeah, Exactly. Vinny?
No, absolutely, I agree to Ross and you. But I think each of the processes have their own set of advantages associated with it. Obviously, if you are a more governed organization and you are able to demonstrate the best of the class security to your competitors or to your even to the customers there, obviously you have a competitive advantage on top of it. Uh, we have seen that many organizations, so large organizations also have a control environment and then have two distinct kind of a control environment. And then when you compare, so an organization could be just an ISO 27001 certified versus an organization which is following some of the best practices standard like NIST for that matter, or uh, uh, ISO 27000 and including 22301 or 31000 for that matter. Obviously, an organization who have most of the certifications would obviously be given weightage. You don't know the what is the control environment and how they have been able to gauge to the certification, but obviously it has its own set of competitive advantage over the other. So, and then when you if I had talk about it personally, if I am going and looking at getting into a contract with any of the customer today, I would obviously like to understand their security posture. And obviously I'm not going to do an audit or a due diligence on top of it, but I would definitely be like to see what all certification standards or best practices that they're following, and I'll go with the words that they're talking about. So obviously that gives you an edge. Obviously some of the practices that we are following across our organization, either is a qualitative or a quantitative or a hybrid, obviously gives an advantage over to something which has not been completely been followed across the organization, and an organization which is not even doing the smallest of the piece in from a security standpoint. So you always see to gain an advantage out of it.
Yeah, no, it's very true actually. And one of the things that you mentioned that was really important is, and I talk ad nauseum about in any presentations I do, is the importance of following a best practice. You know, follow something. If it's CIS, NIST, you know, ISO 20, like something, because especially for global organizations, where if you're using a global standard, for instance, that the whole company can get behind, it means that any independent audits that are done around the world by established auditors, they recognize what these are. They know what these standards are. It's not some cherry pick thing or custom made best practices that somebody came up with, and it's different for every business unit within the organization. So yeah, it's a very good point that you brought up there as well, especially from both of you. So next. So this is a really important question, actually, because as much as we like to talk about the idea of following best practices and using, trying to develop a risk management program within an organization, one of the questions that always gets asked is like, how difficult is this going to be? Like, we're not used to doing these things. We're literally be starting from scratch. What are some of the challenges that you've seen out there when you're working with organizations around, trying to use these approaches? And that question goes to Vinny.
So I would say any of the approaches today you follow, cyber risk quantification as a process itself is a little complex, and then nobody can just shy away from it. uh, it's a sophisticated process. You need to understand the set of formulas that you're going to adopt. There are various set of frameworks which are there out in the market. What is the best optimal for your organization? So just to give an example, and before we actually hit the cyber risk quantification piece, even when you talk about the initial, which is the ISO 27001, and when we are used to talk about qualitative risk analysis, at that time also a lot of people have a struggle whether we are going to use some kind of an octave methodology in terms of following it, or we are going to follow Mehari, or we are going to just go ahead and just do a normal general risk management and we'll customize our own set of framework, or which we are going to follow across the organization. The debate was still there at that point of time. Similar is the debate today, even when you're talking about cyber risk quantification. There are various set of frameworks, there are various set of solutions which are there. uh, which one to follow, which one not to follow, I think that debate is still there, and I think that's the legacy debate. But my only point of view would be that, see, anything which you try to do something new for your organization and try to adopt, obviously you will come with some challenges, and once you have been able to overcome those challenges with the set of methodologies and framework that you have adopted best suited for your organization, I am sure the war is over for you internally and externally also. So once you have been able to adopt any of the solution tools, they might be following different set of methodologies, standards in order to really process and manage some of these pieces on the ground for your organization. But I think I would say that pick up any one of them and start just going following it religiously for from your organization's perspective. And once you have started doing it over a period of time, you will see that it's a cakewalk for you, and you will be able to easily overcome the challenges that you have been facing in the erstwhile.
Russ?
Well, the challenges that I see with this, first off, this is a practice I've been using since early in my career, and the challenges that I've encountered generally boil down to some things that are fairly mechanical. But there's one thing in particular. First off, people need to understand the difference between a security framework like the ISO or the NIST or any of those, and that is actually a framework that follows the understanding of risk, because you have to know what you're going to fix. Understanding the risk part helps inform you about what the framework will then do for you to counteract the risk that you're going to find. Another challenge that they come across is doing a qualitative risk assessment is relatively easy. You're constructing a scenario, some kind of an event causing some kind of an impact, some kind of business loss resulting. So that's fairly easy. But the quantitative part, people tend to find very tedious. And it is because it requires so much data. Now, this serves as a challenge because risk analysis is not something you do once and then feel like you've mastered it. It is something, and this is to a point that Vineet mentioned, it is something that you have to commit to long term. And to really accrue the benefits that you can get from this, it really must be institutionalized and become part of your overall culture. Because in adopting it, you're committing to a long-term asset management, vulnerability management, whichever way you want to call it. You're committing to a long-term program of looking at risk, getting actionable intelligence as the product from it, institutionalizing the methods and the approach and the understanding so that you can get the real value long term. Doing it once will give you a picture, but it won't give you the trend. As we've all seen, Vineet alluded to this earlier, the trend of COVID-19 has produced a landslide of attacks simply because we have a more insecure environment now with many more people working remotely than had been before. Businesses making adjustments. Those are always highly vulnerable times when you're doing changes of that magnitude. You first have to pick the methodology you want to use, and it needs to align with the kind of business you're in. Some are better for certain kinds of businesses than others. That's one of the challenges. They don't know quite how to choose. Second off, committing to it is a problem because of the tedium of doing quantitative, the, shall we say, the loose data, because data quality matters in all of these, the questionable data quality that might come with qualitative. And so they are put off by the mechanisms themselves. These things tend to be automated in certain systems. There are products out there that will do this, but they still don't defray the tedium of actually going out, finding the data, putting it together, painting a picture, and then coming up with a way of analyzing it. Then the final challenge that I come across is your data gets questioned, your results get questioned. And sometimes it's a case of they simply don't want to hear the bad news, your audience that is. They don't want to hear the bad news because it means they're going to have to take money away from revenue generation, because the fact is this is a cost. And they don't want to do that. And the bad news basically backs them into a corner, and they don't particularly like that because now that they know, they're going to be expected or even required to act. There really isn't a way to overcome that unless you commit long-term at an enterprise level and institutionalize the process. There's a tremendous amount of business value to be gained from this, as we've already discussed in this webinar. And if people can be enabled to see the value that this brings to the reputation, the quality, the safety, the security of the business as a standalone or in their supply chain, they'll begin to see that there's a real positive value to investing in making these changes and understanding it. As a manager myself, I always tell my people, I want to hear the bad news first. Good news can wait because it's good news. But bad news addresses something that needs to be addressed now. That's how the good can be seen in this risk management information, because it gives us a chance to fix something that will improve things for the future. A cost now perhaps, but it can produce better revenue, better and stronger customer relationships in the future. So overcoming those challenges can really make a difference, a positive difference in the culture and the performance of the organization that chooses that course.
Yeah, no, both of you came up with obviously really great points. One of the things that I wanted to tack on was mentioned earlier was the fact that doing these risk assessments is really important as a first step, because you really need to understand what are the challenges for the organization, because it's not just about technology. It could be just literally where you exist in the world. There could be geological challenges. There could be, civil unrest. There could be any number of different things that could jeopardize your business. These things really need to be identified up front, which will then inform whatever standards or frameworks that you then put into place there, because now you have an understanding of where you need to spend money and resources to be able to best protect the organization based on that understanding of risk. So all really good points. Next question. Goes to Vinny. How do you address the problem of inaccurate information being used to determine risk in an organization will ultimately lead to inaccurate results? And this speaks to a little bit about the question earlier, because the challenges around putting this together also plays into how you put this together as well, the information inputs that you need in order to start a program like this in the first place. So I'll take that, hand that to Vinny.
No, so absolutely, Ken. I think if you have the wrong set of information which is coming in, it will obviously going to have an impact on your entire risk analysis process. Uh, but if you look at it today, when we were talking about qualitative risk analysis, is again a subjective process, right? Where we used to go ahead and do interviews with the stakeholders across the organization in order to understand what is this of a risk and importance for them as an organization, and what is that a data set that carries a lot of importance. Given that point, a lot of times we have seen that these informations maybe or may not be accurate to the T for the organization, because everybody have a different set of understanding, everybody have a different set of view in terms of understanding how the data has been managed and flow. So at this point of time, it's important that you need to understand both the outside and the internal context of the organization before even you approach some of these methodologies. You need to understand what all are those assets that are getting communicated to the external world versus what is getting coming in out in your organization, what is going out of your organization. It's important to understand and drill down. So before you are actually performing any of the risk analysis, whether it's qualitative and quantitative, you need to first understand some of these pieces which are very critical. And while you are having any conversation with your stakeholders in terms of performing some of these analysis, you need to go and ask them the right set of questions in order to arrive with the right set of information, which will be going as an input parameter into your risk analysis process. Uh, why this is important today is because the dynamics have changed. The customer propositions, the way they look at security have completely changed. Today, cybersecurity is an important topic into every board members discussion. So any board meeting that happens across the organization is an important item which is getting discussed and asked. So if you are not able to identify the right set of risks for your organization at the right point of time, you will not be able to actually invest into the right set of technologies or right set of solutions or right set of frameworks. And for that, it may lead to an incorrect practice across your organization. You might be investing on a wrong set of control or a wrong set of technology without being able to actually protect your environment, and that may lead expose your entire organizational system infrastructure. So you have to understand to the T today. Today, a CISO's job does not only remain that he is only getting an analysis done and then it's over. I think it's important for him to be as a business leader, as a security function within the organization, to understand what are those data in the information set are being collected. Is your team rightly performing the right set of activities? Are there the right set of information that are collected from the systems in order to calculate the risk? Either you are taking the right set of input from the external environment in order to calculate. So all of these parameters today have to be looked into, including your suppliers and the third parties, what Ross mentioned in his previous discussion. uh, it's important that you gather all of these inputs appropriately in order to ensure that you have the accurate results coming out of your entire process.
Absolutely. Russ?
I think that this points back to that question, to that point we were all making, and that risk analysis, risk assessment process is very much a business problem. The question as it's being asked is the same as you encounter in any business process where you're looking to come up with a solution to a particular set of conditions. Data quality, data accuracy, data verification, data reliability, all of those have to be addressed. In my experience using risk analysis as a method of managing the cybersecurity approach over the years, data quality, data accuracy, and in fact, what data are you using were always questions I would get. So I learned very quickly that having the right data from a valid source and verifying that the data is in fact the kind of data that I need to represent the problem I'm trying to model, directed towards coming up with a solution. This is the same problem we face in every business question. Where did you get your data? What does it mean? How is it interpreted? Is it coming from a valid, reliable source? Because using the point to shoot down a risk analysis, as I mentioned before, because it's bad news and we don't want any of that. This is one of the easiest legs of this particular tripod stool to shoot out because they question your data. If they really don't want to hear it, there's really not much you can do about it. But you have to find out where you can get the right data, which means you have to be able to construct your problem properly. Then you go out and find the right data. You take nothing for granted. You validate the data source so that it's coming from the right kind of source that people already have recognition and hopefully some trust in. But then you have to be very realistic in what you're putting together, because the risk analyst is always tempted to skew the data in some way to make whatever case he wants. And what he has to do, sadly sometimes, is he has to let the data and the results speak for themselves. Sometimes what he thinks is a problem, the data shows is really not the problem he thinks it is. Other times it's far worse than he thinks it is. So accurate data, reliable, validated data is always the problem faced. And it is one of the great weaknesses in the way some people perform the risk analysis process. And in order for this to become a reliable, trustworthy, actionable intelligence producing process that becomes institutionalized, it's really one of the very first problems you have to overcome. And it's a mandatory problem to resolve.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that it points to as well that was mentioned earlier was the fact that, it's not a one and done. You don't just do this the one time and then you're good to go after that. Even if, your initial attempt at this doesn't include all of the relevant information that you need to put in to make the risk analysis valuable. I think just going through the process and learning about this and becoming educated about the way this works will help inform what you need to also be putting in there, because understanding what elements you need to put into an organization it's not easy for an organization up front to understand what these things are. I mean, they can include, there's two principles within the company or two stakeholders are absolutely vital for the longevity for this company. What happens if they disappear somehow? How's that going to affect the company?
I'd like to add one final point on this particular thing, which was prompted by something you just said. Most people look at this, and this is business executives and senior management and board members. They look at this as one of two things. They look at it as either an exercise, meaning that it's a one and done in their minds. The way it should be looked at is a process. When you look at things in the form of a process, It is a progressively improving thing. Cybersecurity today looks at things as a repetitive remediation problem. It's like fixing the same problem the same way each and every time it comes up and never improving things. One of the real benefits, and this is part of the sales job, to be frank, that we have to make with this kind of an exercise,
Yep.
it's going to be a progressive sequence of executions. And as with all processes, the data quality will improve as we learn and perform, and our results will improve as a consequence, which gives more weight, more emphasis on institutionalizing the process and making it simply a way of doing business and part of your culture.
100%. Next question is going to go to Ross. Your risk analysis results are frequently challenged regarding its realism. It's something that we touched on a little bit earlier about priorities and what your interpretation of an impact depiction would be. How do you address these challenges to ensure the message is actually heard and accepted? This is going to go to Ross.
Let's go back to what we just finished with. The data quality, where it comes from, what it says. Many times, if it's an historical fact, there really is no dispute about what it is. You know, this car ran into that fire hydrant. That's kind of an obvious thing. But some of this data is not quite so obvious. And what people are looking for is a cause and effect relationship. And sometimes it's very obvious, and sometimes it's quite subtle. They always challenge, I shouldn't say always, I should say often challenge the realism. And that's where the risk analyst really needs to be sure that they're treating the data objectively, that perhaps multiple opinions from subject matter experts within their own enterprise, their opinions might be valuable. The realism has to reflect data quality. It has to reflect real things. Sometimes that makes your case very strongly, and sometimes it sort of weakens it because the evidence doesn't really substantiate what you may be claiming. This is a case of trying to sell people on the idea that the analysis shows that this is going to happen if this incipient event occurs. Sometimes they don't want to make that connection. Sometimes they do, but your data has to reflect a train of logic that is basically, well, it's going to be challenged for certain, but it has to be something that at the end, all they can do is refuse to accept it rather than have a logical argument that refutes it. When I present this sort of thing to the customer, which is usually to a board or to senior management, I have to know my audience. I have to understand what they're going to do in the way of poking holes in any analysis that's brought in front of them and prepare for that. I have to be willing to admit that these things are questionable. I can't say that something is certain when it's not. It may be highly indicative of something, but it may not be certain, and certainty may be what they're looking for. So I have to speak in very careful terms. The feedback that I get from them when I do this tells me whether or not they're hearing me because they're open to it, or they're not hearing me because they're not open to it. Facts can be convincing, but facts can also convince people in ways that you don't want them to, because they all have more than one side. So part of this is a bit on salesmanship, and part of it is just being a good data analyst, a good data scientist, and making the proper case and letting it speak for itself.
Totally agreed. Vinny?
Yep. So I'll quickly take up an example and to make it more relevant. If most of us remember in the year 2009, 2010, there was a swine flu which was been causing havoc across the globe. And then at that point of time also, we all were on our war foot, and we were taking a set of preventive actions in terms of measuring the temperature of employees before they are entering the office, and then doing all set of measures in order to protect our employees and their health at that point of time. When we look back a year back, which is in 2020, I think it is a similar kind of an environment that got created initially, and then it got a little more drastic than what we all expected. But again, if I have to go back compared to the scenario in 2009 versus what has happened last year, and then if we have to relate, the important question is, have we all learned a lesson out of 2009 incident that happened? And then and did we prepare ourselves to be coming across with a similar kind of, or maybe or even more, a more even a harder magnitude of something which has happened to us from a COVID perspective. But all of us have put it into the back burner, and we thought that nothing of that sort could ever happen. That is where your risk analysis have actually failed, if you have to look at it. Most of the organization, in fact, it has happened, and then we all took some kind of countermeasures in terms of protecting against that, but it prioritized got uh, negligent because of the fact that it has not happened for over 10 years, and we never thought that something of that could even come across. And immediately once we were stuck with this COVID scenario, everybody of us have to again go back to the same set of shoes, look into what was been done, and then we started putting in across measures in order to protect the safety of our employees. uh, So I think some of these pieces have to be looked in and thought through right from the beginning. An incident, if in case it has happened, does not mean that it cannot occur. And what has you done enough in order to ensure that you have the most of the corrective measures in the place in order to overcome some of these challenges? I think we largely forget to look into some of these pieces, the dated information, and when we move forward. I think that is where the organizations have to now really think through. uh, it had the COVID as an incident itself, or a event, or whatever you call it, or with the kind of pandemic it has caused havoc which has created across the globe. You need to learn lessons out of it. It's one of the incident which has happened, and there could be something more a bigger magnitude that could happen. I wish it never happens, and that is what. But while you are preparing yourself, you have to prepare your organization from that perspective, where something more dangerous magnitude could happen. And I think that is where you have to make your business leader understand that today it is one of the scenarios. There could be something which could happen even more bigger in terms of the magnitude, and we need to build up our infrastructure. We need to scale up our environment. We have to scale up adequately, provide training to our employees across the organization, so in case of a business continuity, in case of a business uh, any kind of a disaster in the future, we are able to well recover in time, and we are able to keep our employees and then the organization's information safe at the most of the safest place. So that is where I'll talk about.
Yeah, actually, you made a good point there, because being able to identify these risks, and they do feed into things like your disaster recovery and business continuity. I mean, if you look at what happened last year, it was basically a complete debacle, right? So all of a sudden, COVID happens, everybody has to go home. IT departments don't have a way for these people to come in. So what they do is they poke holes in the firewall to allow people to directly access their machines at work. And then, this is a haven for the hackers to be able to get in, because they run a brute force attack, and then and you're in. 2 years ago, Verizon actually, their report that came out said that 50% of ransomware is a result of people just being able to get in through the firewall. So this points to really bad planning or lack of planning on the part of these organizations without doing a proper risk assessment. Another example is emergency services. The hospitals, for instance, they'll come up with scenarios where there's a massive collision on the highway, and lots and lots of casualties. Nobody wants to see that happen. But in the event of something like that happening, they need to be prepared for things like that. And so they work through these scenarios on a consistent basis to make sure that they're constantly ready. They have drills in place, procedures in place, and everybody knows what their role in that scenario is. It's really that sort of overarching message is really what we're trying to get across to these organizations is you got to try to elaborate on, think imaginatively of the things that could potentially affect your business, and put that in and feed that in as part of that information. Like we talked about in the original one is, sort of bad data in, bad data out. And so you really need to try to think through all of the things that could be a risk to your organization. We talk ad nauseum about the reasons why organizations need to do these things, and I'll pose this one to I think it's Ross. It's your turn to be able to accept. No, actually, Vinny. Let's go to Vinny. So, why is there a lack of acceptance of quantitative methodology?
I think we have answered that in the past during one of the question, but again we'll go back. I think it's a complex process, and then people see it as a very complex and tedious process. What Ross has already mentioned. I think we have to overcome that mindset. Nothing is tedious, nothing is complex. It's just to adopt the practices. And once you are able to adopt the practice and bring it as a regime across your organization from a ongoing basis, obviously some of these pieces are going to be a cakewalk for you in the near future. Uh, One of the important pieces that while everybody look at it quantitative, they say that okay, there are formulas which are associated with it, and then the moment the formulas or the simulations come into picture, people get into a panic state, and then nobody really wants to uh, get into that kind of a method where numbers and I think in some of the conversation Ross also talked about the numbers. So these are all about numbers. So and when you talk about numbers, if in case is actually going to talk about or derail if in case is directly going to have an impact, and if any of the numbers go wrong at any point of time, it may have a quite a devastated effect on the entire process that you have followed. So when you go back to a management and you say that okay, no, we were initially calculating a score of let's say a 4 out of 5, and now while we are reperforming, I see there is a decline in terms of the ranking from a 3 from a 4 to a 3 over the where it should have been the other way around, where it should have progressed. uh, it may cause a lot of havoc across the organization and even across the senior leadership across the organization. So I think people are afraid of actually playing with numbers. But my feeling is that this is the most optimal hybrid approach. Adding a qualitative plus a quantitative is going to be very beneficial from your organization from a long-term perspective.
Thank you. Russ?
I think Vinny's point about it being a tedious process, if I look at it from a strictly human factors perspective, that's the main reason. But there's a deeper reason, and that is by using more data, you provide your opponents with many more targets that they're going to use to poke holes in your analysis. Where did you get that data? How do you know it's any good? There really isn't a way that we found that really automates this process better. And I think that there may be an opportunity here to, now that we've got more data available, to take a quantitative method using qualitative methods, to Vineet's point about the hybrid approach, using qualitative methods as a way of visualizing and validating the kinds of numbers, the types of numbers and sources that we're going to need them from. It may be possible to generate process automation algorithms that can help with better accuracy, better results calculation, and so on, and streamline this process a bit. But the plain and simple truth that I've encountered is it's just a tedious process. A lot of data, a lot of potential holes, a lot of questions about validity, and so on. It really makes it a very unattractive thing. The other part of it is numbers lie. And I'm afraid that we have to recognize that that's one of the arguments that's thrown against us when it comes to quantitative analysis. Numbers can be used to express anything you want them to. And it breeds a sort of mistrust, not because our analyses have not been proper, but because numbers generally are thought to lie any way that the speaker, that the analyst wants them to do so. And that, again, raises the question of data quality, sources, etc. So by doing this more, by doing more of it and doing it properly and letting the results speak for themselves, we can build up the credulity that gives our results the kind of recognition and acceptance that they need. So I think that a lot of it is just human factors and distrust of numbers generally, but I think it's also an opportunity where we can counteract that by doing better jobs at building automated processes, building better algorithms, and just working with it over time.
It's great. I think one of the things to take into consideration as well is that, obviously the larger the organization that you're working with, the more complex the approach is going to be, because there's so many more areas of risk. But for small, small to semi-medium sized organizations, this doesn't have to be a science project. It could literally be a few columns in a spreadsheet as an initial go around that you can actually do yourself. And, as you learn this methodology, you can expand on it, but you need to start somewhere. So I think it's really important to understand that there is a difference in the amount of effort that's required to get this going, depending on the size of the organization.
Ken, One quick thing. I think you hit on something key. The size of the organization brings out the old joke that we always make about how does one eat an elephant. If they look at a large organization, no, I think that this is very real. Looking at a large organization, the person who's tasked with doing this automatically sees it as that elephant, and they really don't know where to start because the very size and scope of the problem is intimidating. And to the point you were
Right.
just making, breaking it down into more, well, bite-sized pieces is a way to get the process started, not to do it all for a 10,000 member organization, but to literally eat this elephant a bite at a time. Do modular type, bring the results together, not to form a complete picture of the enterprise, that would probably be a practical impossibility, but you have to do it in a bite-sized, manageable piece. So I think your point is very well taken about how the size and scope of the problem could itself be, shall we say, an antagonist to us getting this
Mm.
process adopted.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things that I learned to understand about organizations as well is that you, you mentioned before about having to sell. We pretty much have to sell everything that we're doing to some degree on there. So trying to sell, the idea of trying to eat this elephant all in one go is just not going to get the traction and build the inertia that we need to really, get an organization behind a process like this. And
Mm-hmm.
so starting
That's
small, starting with a small group of people, and then building out from there
mm-hmm.
tends to be a way that this works much better.
Yeah, so, and to add to what Ken mentioned, and I think Ross made a very valid point that you cannot just go with a complete elephant in one go. You have to break it into pieces. And I think the most optimal approach is that either you take it a functional view or a unit-wise view of your organization. Maybe if in case you have 20 offices across the globe, you can either split it into a region-based, or you can take up, let's say, a functional kind of a view, whether you are only talking about the sales organization or a manufacturing organization, based on the priorities and the data set you foresee for your organization, which is of more critical importance. And based on that, you can actually start thinking through as to which of the areas, whether it's a functional view or whether it's a organizational view, which you are going to take in order to actually approach some of these processes.
Yeah, I absolutely agreed. I know from my own personal experience, um, starting off with a small group of people and really perfecting the process, what tends to happen is you then get other groups that start poking their heads in and going, "Hey, what are you guys doing? That looks really interesting. Can we get involved?" And so, being able to work it in that way, as opposed to trying, because otherwise you're trying to sell the process to an entire organization, and it's just not going to happen. And I think for your own, benefit and success, it's much easier to start in a very small way and then move yourself out. I think we could probably answer this one pretty quickly because a lot of what's in this question has already been covered. But I guess if you could summarize this, I'll start with you, Ross.
Well, the answer to this question is very much what you just said. It's a fairly quick one. Boards and senior leadership are always concerned about the company, the institution, but they're also concerned about their own professional and personal liability, especially board members. By using a risk analysis method, because they're doing personal risk analysis in their heads every day, can I be held responsible? Can I be held liable? And that's a fair thing for them to do because in their role, they do take on an awful lot of this. So by using a method like this, we can help, well, guide their thinking by informing them better about exactly what sort of liabilities. The problem that we face is once you've learned of a problem, there is almost even a legal requirement to do something about it if it's possibly negative to the institution or the workforce. And once you know, you're expected to act. By informing them, we put them in that position. But leaving them hanging like that and not giving them a way to constructively, creatively, positively approach the problem is like leaving them on a raft with no water and no food. And that's exactly how they feel, very exposed. So present a problem, present the facts, present a solution, is a way of addressing this in a way that they can now act upon positively, effectively, and manage their own personal risk as well as the institutions.
Absolutely agreed, Benny.
Yeah, so I think I'll add to what Ross point. I think there are important parameters that are derived out of the entire quantitative risk analysis. One, it gives you the financial impact. It gives you the dollar value in terms of what is going to have an impact to your organization. The second, it helps you in terms of understanding more from the maturity of your organization. So you can now, with the set of data and inputs that you have gathered from so many different stakeholders across the organization, both internally as well as externally, you are better able to understand the maturity of your cybersecurity posture. The board today wants to understand where do you stand as a. So let's say if in case you have derived any kind of a formula or any practice or framework, and you say that okay, out of on a scale of 1 to 10, if I am doing at 8, the board would still be convinced, and they'll ask you questions like, how can we go from an 8 to a 10? And you can, with that, you can actually go back to them and say, okay, these are the set of areas of priorities that I need to invest upon. This may reduce my financial impact from this value to this value. uh, I think they would better be able to appreciate the conversation. And as Ross pointed out, they keep on doing some kind of a risk analysis in their head. So that help them in the set of comfort. That will give them the comfort in terms of, okay, we are following the right set of processes. We know where we have to move over a period of time. And even the CISOs will be able to get articulate and looked at more from a business leader rather than just being looked at one of an enabler from a security standpoint. And you will be better able to communicate to the business function across the leader, across the organization. You can be able to actually converse a more holistic conversation with your CRO function, with your CFO function, and you will be able to actually help them in terms of getting you the right set of resources, the budgets, and all those that is required as a support from the senior leadership.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, one of the things that we have all seen over the years is that you go into organizations and the executives and the board members, they really don't even understand what their risks are when it comes to what they own within an organization. And of course, the bigger the organization, the more difficult it is for them to even be able to wrap their heads around what this is. And there tends to be a gap between what the business understands or needs to understand and what's happening in the IT world or in audit or in all these other places. There needs to be a way to explain to the business what that risk is, because everybody keeps saying that they're ultimately responsible, but in a lot of cases they don't really understand what they're ultimately responsible for. And so being able to make good decisions around what they need to do and spend, and what resources they need, and technologies and processes and everything else that they need, this is not presented to them in a way that makes sense from a business logic perspective, it's not going to get off the ground. And there seems to be a huge gap between the operational side of the business and what the business understands is actually going on. So again, the importance of being able to adapt a process like this into an organization is really paramount. Final question on here actually is, it's a good one actually. What are your projections for advances in cyber risk management? We'll give that to Vinny.
So I'm sure with the advances that are happening, with the set of technologies that we are adopting, again, I'm not qualitative and quantitative debate might not only end up here and there. I'm sure with new set of getting into the IoT world and then talking about the artificial intelligence or machine learning, we have to start looking at adopting some of the new advanced practices which you can be able to better embed into your entire control environment and manage. Uh, the technology is going to keep on evolving, and your assets and then your information is also going to keep on evolving, including the adversaries and their attack patterns are also going to evolve. So there I will this be the end of the show from a qualitative or a quantitative? I am not sure at this point of time, but we will have to wait for the future to come. And I'm sure as the time evolves, there'll be some new practices that you have to follow in order to overcome some of these challenges.
Russ?
Well, I think this is one of the things that I can kind of tip my hand a little bit. As I mentioned before, people don't like doing this because A, it's a tedious process, and B, all you get out of it is bad news. The problem has to be overcome by advances in first wider adoption, better data quality. But overall, what we have to do is come up with a way of getting the data from the right sources. And as I said earlier, the fact that COVID has brought about a lot more of this kind of data, impact, attack, and that sort of thing. We have more data available. When we use data and we use these models, and the models have been around for quite a long time, actually, we can bring machine learning, process automation, and so on, and develop algorithms for how these things actually work. And then, of course, we go through the process of that. So I think two basic things will work to our advantage in advancing the adoption of cyber risk management. First off, we apply the same sort of business logic that has developed the quantitative tools that businesses used for the better part of the last century and a half, maybe much longer. But we also have to develop some things that really take valid data source and data elements and generate outputs that can then be validated by the evidence that the world produces from these kinds of models. And I think machine learning, AI, and that sort of thing, and different sorts of agencies, meaning machine agents that rest on various kinds of machines to give us monitoring data as a form of validation. I think if we can advance that part of the technology and get more and more people and more organizations to adopt risk management as an institutionalized process, I think overall we're going to form maybe a small tidal wave, but a wave of better adoption, better products, better results, and that sort of thing, so that it becomes more a normal, natural part of how a business does its business.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, and your points around AI are really valid, because if you think about the way we typically do things in today's world, you know, it's a lot of it is a very manual process. It takes up a lot of people hours. It takes up a lot of time. Companies have to invest in a lot of resources to be able to manage things that are very manual in process. And what this does is it does introduce risk into the organization, because you're allowing humans to perform these processes, and if they break in any way, that's not always easily observable. Hence the reason why so many companies are getting taken down by ransomware. It's really ubiquitous. But I mean, I've seen for myself how AI is actually helping organizations to be able to consume these processes in a much faster way, and allowing the people that are actually responsible for them the time to be able to do the work correctly, you know, efficiently, you know, with consistency as well, which is another thing that's really needed in this world, is a lot of consistency, a sort of discipline around the way you, you know, the way you tackle these things.
Yep, agreed.
And that's it. This is time for our question and answer period. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vineet, Ken, and Ross. I think it was such an informative session for me as well as our audiences. They have been very, very intrigued about this session, and we have a lot of questions to answer. But before we move on to a question answer, just would like to give a little bit of information for our attendees. So this session is in sync with EC Council's Computer Hacking and Forensic Investigator Program, which is CHFI. So this maps to Forensic Investigator and Consultant Digital Forensics. Anyone with CHFI certification is eligible for 4,000 plus job vacancies globally, with an average salary of $95,000 US per annum. If you're interested to know more, let us know your preferred mode of training in the poll, and we will reach out to you. Okay, so Ken, can we move on to the questions?
Questions from the audience?
Yes. So the first question is mainly for you, Ken. What do you think is the future of cyber espionage? According to the trends, from where are the most attacks can be expected?
So I love that question, actually, because these are the sorts of things that I talk about a lot in presentations. So you know, there are known actors in the world from an espionage perspective that you know, let's put it this way: espionage has been around forever. The only difference is nowadays is that we're able to use cyber means to be able to do what people are doing. One of the areas that we have as a real problem is, you know, how do you actually deal with that from a legal perspective? Because it seems that, you know, if I walk across the street and throw a hammer through the window for somebody, you know, somebody's house, I could get arrested because it's a criminal thing. But if I, you know, hack into that person's house and steal all their stuff and be able to cover my tracks on there, it's almost an impossibility to find that person. So when it comes to espionage, really attribution is the real problem right now, because, you know, nation states, they hop from country to country to country, they cover their tracks very easily, and by the time they get to you, you know, their last known port of entry was in some obscure country somewhere where they didn't really arrive from. That big problem that we have in the world is that there is no legal framework that's been built to deal with espionage from countries. Like, there are no punitive actions that are available to anybody from a legal perspective to be able to, you know, penalize countries for doing these things, or for any kind of entity to do these things because of attribution. You know, until we get to the state, one of the things that I don't want to belabor this answer, but one of the things that I see that's a real problem for us is that, you know, we come up with legislation to be able to fine companies into oblivion because they make mistakes with cybersecurity. The very people that are finding those are no good at cybersecurity themselves either. But if you think about it from a, you know, the larger perspective, because there is no legal framework in place from a global perspective, where, you know, there's 100 companies that have signed on to say, you know, in the event of this happening, this is what we're going to do as a punitive action to an organization. Every organization is left to have to deal with this on their own. And so, you know, it's on my own. I'm not speaking for the panel here at all. The idea of just finding companies into oblivion just because they made a mistake just seems to be a very unfair way of doing these things, because every company is just basically left on their own to deal with these things without any kind of support from the governments of their, you know, their respective countries. So until that changes, we're just going to be living with things the way they are.
Okay. Thank you so much. Vineet, Ross, you want to add something to it?
The only thing I'd add to Ken's point is, from a legislative or legal construct standpoint, as long as there is self-interest in any government having its own espionage, or for that matter, a private enterprise, as long as there is an interest and an advantage to them, they're never going to be in favor of doing that. Countries will never cease having intelligence services and espionage agents, because it's always them protecting their own interests or seeking economic advantage or military advantage, obviously. So I wouldn't expect a legal framework to capture and prosecute international agents on this level for as long as there is the billions and even trillions of dollars wrapped up in advantage by those who do it.
Very good point.
Sometimes the problems that we face really are a case of following the money. And I think that in today's world, with much of it being economic type espionage, industrial rather than military, certainly there's still a presence of that. I think as long as that's the case, following the money is going to be a pretty clear indicator of who's doing what, and why there's very likely never going to be a universal legal framework to prosecute people for this.
I think, and then just to add to what Ken and Ross said, I think the cyber espionage has not only been limited to in order to gain access to the confidential information of the military or the government agencies. I think it has gone way beyond that right today. There are nation state hackers who have been sponsored in order to gain information through these vaccines which are getting actually manufactured, and then I think it's been sponsored by the nation states themselves. So if you have to look at it, I think we are going way beyond than what we were expecting at this point of time. I think the damage is again but however, if you look at it, the damage has been started happening to some of these firms, and then given the extent of damage that is happening, it may be eventually be who will be impacted. This is the general mass who are there associated with them. They are going to get impacted. So I think everybody has to think through today in the given scenario, and obviously I'm not going to see that this is going to get stopped near time soon. Obviously, there'll be a surge in terms of some of these pieces, but you have to be very cautious about while you are adopting some of these practices. It may have a larger impact to the larger community, so you have to take into account on those pieces.
Thank you so much. So we'll just take one last question because I think we'll go overboard otherwise. So how do you analyze risk where the stakeholders are not willing to divulge system information? They probably only comply when a monitoring for compliance is going on, but disable security rules in your absence.
That's a wider practice which has been adopted at most of the places. That is what I would say. I think again, it's more on the culture. I think organization cannot just do adopt some of these best practices just in order to be compliant to the monitoring authorities or the regulatory authorities who are visiting them. And I think this all of these best practices, the standards, frameworks, these regulations which have been defined and designed by the regulators for the organizations to follow, it is in the interest of the organization itself. Now, how much you adopt as a practice as a in your day in day out business is something which the organization, but if in case you're not following, obviously the who is going to get impacted eventually, it is you who is going to get impacted. So you have to be very cautious of some of these pieces. You have to look into some of these pieces while you are adopting this practice, just not for the sake of following it, but rather it is something which you should adopt religiously as part of the culture. I'll give you a very practical example. I've seen certain organizations which are there, and how they operate is while they are deploying DLP on agents on their users' laptop, they do it only for those certain set of users whom the organizations see are handling sensitive information, and they forget to leave out some of the individuals who not are not into that critical role, but are part of the organization. Now, any user, if he is aware that I have a DLP agent which is installed in my system, I would be happy to send out that communication to an individual who does not have a DLP agent and is easily can be tracked today. We know we can see icons on my desktop laptops, and can be easily identified whether it's a DLP agent which is sitting on my laptop or not. Or even if I'm trying to send out one communication, if I'm getting blocked, I know that my system is have a DLP agent when I'm getting tracked and I'm monitored. So again, coming to the same point, it is the culture which you have to build across the organization. And then as we all talk about, information security or cyber security is not the responsibility of one individual, it is the responsibility of everyone across the organization. And in when I say everyone, I think it is the senior leadership, it is the individuals who are working in the organization, it is everyone's responsibility. You cannot have such kind of a control where you are trying to distinguish between a set of users across the organization. However, the impact may be the same.
Russ?
I think to the question that you posed, what do you do trying to do a risk analysis if you can't get access to data that someone has but won't release? This is a problem that I've faced in all the years I've been doing this, because there's always some kind of data that you won't be able to get a hold of. Sometimes the problem in getting a hold of the data is to release it says something about how weak your program is. If it has a compliance component, you could actually be admitting to your regulatory agency that you've given us the rules, but we're not following them. You know, it says all kinds of negative things about the organization, but it's more complex than that, because we're required to do something, the risk analysis. We're required to have the data, which is in the possession of someone who won't release it for the reasons I've just given, that and some others. And what it does to the analysis is it basically puts you in the position of saying, here is my analysis, and it is accurate, subject to a 50% wiggle factor or error factor, because I don't have these. You're forced then to go on to using assumptions, any one of which, And this may be part of what your audience may seek to do, any one of which could be used to shoot down the analysis and say, well, you can't possibly know that. The problem is, in admitting this stuff, there may be legal or regulatory consequences because the data that you would have to have can be used against the organization to find it out of compliance and then fine it in some way, as well as potential stakeholder liability, personal liability. So it's not a simple problem to solve because of the various issues that may have nothing to do with the quality of your results. It may have to do with other extraneous factors. And this is part of what we've been saying in this presentation, that it needs to become something that is understood, accepted, and institutionalized, and then practiced with commitment. But you have to work through all of these non-technical, more human-based problems to try to get that done, and that will take time. And that's probably a more difficult part of the battle than just coming up with the analytical methods and the framework.
Yeah, I think that it actually presents itself nice and neatly for the whole concept of risk management, where you identify the lack of information as being a risk to the organization and present that as part of your results, because it is a risk, because you don't know, what the lack of that data actually means for the organization. It could be that it's detrimental to the organization. You could end up in serious fines, or it could be that it's very benign and it really means nothing. But without understanding how to, understanding the risks around not having that data is a risk in itself and should be identified as such, with a very, very low score or high level of risk associated with it. Could be a way.
Ken, any last thoughts?
No, any more questions or?
I think we are overboard with the time, so no last questions. So if there are any relevant questions, we'll pass on to the panelists. They will surely get in touch with you. So thank you so much, Ken, Ross, and Vineet. It was such a pleasure having you. Such stalwarts coming on our platform is something that we always cherish. And your information, especially Ross and Vineet, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure. But Ken, thank you for being the showrunner. Thank you for being the moderator. You did an amazing job. Thank you for our audiences for being part of this. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.